Welcome to Politics Chat, in which I try to answer your questions about modern politics. All right, so let's get into some of the easy questions that you asked first of all. Somebody asked, could former President Barack Obama go on to the Supreme Court? And the answer to that is yes, so long as somebody is nominated to the Supreme Court and approved by the Senate, which has to give its advice and consent, then sure. And there actually is a precedent for a president to go on to the Supreme Court. That was William Howard Taft. And that was sort of an interesting story because Taft was the real political mind in his life was his wife, and she was the one who was really behind his political decisions, and all he ever really wanted to be was a Supreme Court justice. So he wins election in part because of their management of the Philippines when the U.S. was there trying to establish U.S. dominance after the Spanish American War, or after the Philippine War, which is really quite a bit different than the Cuban War. Um, and he gets elected to the presidency really because she is behind the idea, and then she has a stroke. And he kind of wanders the White House going, what am I going to do? I mean, she was the political brains here. And if you think about William Howard Taft's presidential career, you can just see he didn't have the kind of political smarts behind him that he had always had behind him before. So one of the first things he does is what Theodore Roosevelt avoided, which is he jumps right into the whole tariff fight, which is a huge deal in the early 20th century. And that just basically sinks his presidency right out of the box. So anyway, certainly Obama could become justice on the Supreme Court. I would not hold my breath if I were you. I think the Obamas have done a lot for this country already, and people tend not to be paying a lot of attention to what the Obama Foundation is doing, but it's actually very active in recruiting and training leaders around the country. So they pretty much have their hands full. Similarly, I did want to add here that you don't have to be a lawyer to be on the Supreme Court, and you don't have to be a former judge. We have gotten there in our modern era, but in fact, generally, until I believe it was um, Sandra Day O'Connor, we always had a politician. I mean, she also was a lawyer as well, but she had been a politician, and it was kind of a agreed on unofficially that there would always be somebody on the Supreme Court who had been a politician, an elected politician, so that they would understand the import of their decisions on the sort of people who had voted for them in the past. So there are very few guardrails around who can be on the court, although obviously we have gone toward judges in the modern era. The trick is they have to be approved by the Senate. All right, so that was an easy one. People also asked what has happened to the strongly popular bipartisan housing bill that both the House and the Senate passed by overwhelming majorities and sent to Trump to sign, only to have him say he would not do so until they passed the what he calls the SAVE Act. And that's the voter ID law that calls for there's a number of versions of it. So the bottom line is it is requiring people to have proof of their citizenship in order to register to vote, and then in many of the incarnations of it in order to vote. And the experts all expect that it will toss a lot of people off off the voting rolls. And I'm how much time do I have? I may or may not go more in depth into that. But the reason that that would be the case is twofold. One, because it would require either that you have a passport, which is not easy to get, especially if you're in a rural area, which is interesting because that has tended to be Republican voters. But you either have to have a passport or a birth certificate, and those have to match your current name. And the people who most often change their names in American society are women overwhelmingly, and of course, trans people. But one of the key pieces here is beginning in 1980, women in America, especially women in America who are Black or brown, began to vote much more strongly for Democrats than men did. So, by getting women out of the voting pool, that should help the Republicans. And this is one of the reasons you're also seeing people talk about getting rid of female voting at all, women's voting at all. But so that's one of the reasons that he wants the SAVE Act. But the other piece of the SAVE Act that is really important is that it required states to give their voter rolls to the federal government. And the federal government was running them through a completely unrelated system. It isn't a database, it's a system that is designed to scour things like databases of people who are receiving benefits. And it's designed to scour those names to find undocumented immigrants or those who are ineligible for certain federal benefits. That was never supposed to have that system, which unfortunately is also called the SAVE system, although it is a completely different acronym, or it's an acronym for a completely different idea and word and everything. And it's much older than this whole new SAVE idea for voting. But the issue with it is twofold. One is that that system was never supposed to have access to the information from U.S. citizens. Are supposed to have pretty strong protections of who can get our information. But two, when in fact a number of states voluntarily gave up their state voter rolls, and the federal government put those voter rolls through this system, it had a false positive rate of at least 14%. People who were in fact legal voters but were said they were not, and then they had to go back through the process of enrolling to vote. And again, with now with this idea of needing to have a birth certificate or a passport, which I have to say, I can put my hands on both of those in my life. And I also still have the exact name I was born with. Cox is my middle name. It is not a hyphenated last name. It was my mother's maiden name. But how many of you can do that? I mean, I only have it because I had to get it all together to get a passport within the last, I don't know how long. But an awful lot of people can't. And it's also not easy to do. It's also fairly expensive if you have to, for example, find a birth certificate or get a new one produced. That's not cheap. And so that's part of what's going on. But the other piece of this is this idea of taking these state voter rolls and chunking them into this system that theoretically will find people who are not eligible for certain federal benefits, but that was never designed to look at voting. And so just last week, a judge in Boston said, prohibited the federal government from continuing to use that SAVE application for looking at. It's not a database. The reason I'm hesitating there is people keep saying it's a database. It's not. It's something you can use to look at databases. It itself is not a database. She said you can't do that. This is an incredible breach of the Privacy Act of 1974, which says that the federal government cannot change the use that it has for your information. So if you hand over your information for one reason or another, they are prohibited by law from using that information for something else. And she said, you guys are way out over your skis here. You can't do that. And just before I came on, ProPublica reported that in fact, the federal government says anyway that it is no longer doing that. All right. So you asked where that is, where the housing bill is. I kind of did a side there on the SAVE Act, but I'm going to come back to the SAVE Act in just a second. the housing bill that Trump said he would not sign, yesterday, again, he said he hadn't even looked at it. He didn't know what was in it, which, by the way, the number of times lately he said, I don't even know what I'm signing, should be this huge red flag to everybody. But anyway, uh, it, everybody keeps saying, well, he's got 10 days to sign it or it automatically becomes a law. But there was a little trick in that, and that is that it's 10 days from the time it gets transmitted to the White House. And House Speaker Mike Johnson, who's a Republican of Louisiana, sat on it for quite a while. It only went to the White House yesterday. And so he's got 10 days from yesterday to either sign it or for it to go into effect. But there is an exception to that, and that is probably unlikely. But if the Congress adjourns within that period of time and the president has not signed it, it is, that's called a pocket veto. It means it doesn't go into effect, and the the president has essentially killed it. And that's very famously in 1864, Lincoln did that with the Wade Davis bill. But theoretically, Congress is not supposed to adjourn until December of 2026. So, they could go real early, but it doesn't look like that. Now, that being said, a couple of more distinctions here that are, so much of this stuff is inside baseball. Congress has been, especially in the House, has been taking long periods of time off. I believe at this point, the Senate has been in session 41 more days than the House has, because Johnson can't control the House. And so every time things go wrong, he sends them home again, which is enormously frustrating to the Democratic members of Congress, because they would actually like to get something done. And they, it's just, you get elected, you actually want to be there. And he's done that again. He sent everybody home today. They weren't supposed to go home until the 2nd of July, which is Thursday, for the 4th of July recess. When they just take a little bit of time off, that's not an adjournment. An adjournment is, we're done with this Congress. We're closing the door on it. It's, the end of the 119th Congress, which is the one I think we're in now. I could be wrong on that. But each Congress has a number, and it's I believe it's a 2-year. Yeah, it's a 2-year session, and it has a number. And an adjournment is the end of that session. Slam the door, stop publishing the congressional record, put it in a binder. We're done for this session. You can have a special session in between two Congresses. Those are emergency sessions called by the president. But I shouldn't say I'm not expecting, who knows, but those are pretty rare. So unless Congress adjourns in the next 10 days, Trump should have to either sign it or veto it. Now, back to the SAVE Act. And by the way, this is what I wanted to talk about today. I just feel like we dove into this rabbit hole and now I can't get out. Trump is desperate to pass this SAVE Act, which suggests just how desperate he is to rig the elections in 2026. And I'm going to come back to that because that's really important. And he, today in Congress, House Speaker Mike Johnson tried to attach the SAVE Act to the National Defense Authorization Act, known as the NDAA. You'll see that number a lot, the NDAA. And the National Defense Authorization Act is a really interesting piece of legislation because it tends to pass. They tend not to mess with that at all, although the Republicans have been messing with it lately. And his idea was that if he attached the SAVE Act to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, that enough Democrats would be afraid of voting against defense authorization and enough Republicans would change their minds that they would enact that they would vote in favor of it. And in fact, enough Republicans joined Democrats to reject that. They said, we're not going to do this. We're not going to attach the SAVE Act to the NDAA. And in so doing, they did a number of things. And the foremost one or the most obvious one out of the box, is they proved once again that Mike Johnson can't count. The Speaker of the House should not bring something to the floor based on the hope it's going to pass. I mean, you look at I was going to say the great speakers in our past, but really any other speaker. And that's the whole point of the House whip, for example, but or the party whip, but to whip votes into line. But virtually any speaker, even the crappy ones, knew how people were going to vote, and they didn't bring things to the floor unless they knew they would pass, unless they found some way to make that happen. And the real master at this, and probably the best in U.S. history, was Nancy Pelosi. One of the further down we have old ones from our past, but any of them, even the weak ones, would never have let that happen, because it's just an enormous embarrassment. So Mike Johnson looks weaker and weaker as we go here. But the other piece of that is that it demonstrates pretty clearly to Trump that even Republicans don't want to pass that SAVE Act. And there are a number of reasons they don't want to. But one of the first and foremost that you're also seeing coming up in states around the Republican dominated states around the country who are refusing to redistrict, no matter how much pressure Trump puts on them, is that Trump cares profoundly about these midterm elections, because he knows that on the other side of them, if the Democrats win control of the House, there will be investigations of his administration. And who boy does he not want that. And yet the Republican Party, members of the Republican Party, have a different set of interests. They would like to have future careers. And they're watching Trump drive them off a cliff, drive the party off a cliff. And they're finally pushing back. Not, as I say, I think, because they are, yeehaw, gung-ho about defending the right to vote, but they know how infuriated people are over Trump right now, and they don't want to sign on to his extremist policies. All right. So is the SAVE Act going to pass? It could. I mean, it certainly still could. But the Republicans are certainly indicating that they are not keen on that. And what that means for the housing bill is unclear. And what it means for the NDAA is unclear as well. All right. So a couple more things. I guess I'll go in a different direction here. What I really wanted to no, let me do one more quick question here. Already at 6:20. Sorry, I'll try and be quicker. People asked me to talk about the law that Texas just passed, saying that school children would have to read passages from the Bible and learn about Christianity. And they're furious at that. And that also is very interesting, because of course this is a violation of the separation of church and state. Absolutely. And I've written about that a lot. Happy to talk about it more. But the whole point of the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment is that the United States does not have an established religion. End of story. And there are many, many reasons for that. But one of the things that jumps out about things like this Texas law saying there will be Bible readings. Which Bible? And this is one of the reasons that the framers did not want to have an established religion in the country, is because they had seen in places like Virginia different Protestant groups fighting with each other and imprisoning each other over, what many people would consider minor doctrinal differences, but those are very, very, very important to the people who adhere to one Bible or another. And we have, a couple of different Bibles that are widely used in the United States. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting about that Bible thing is that it doesn't go into effect until 2030. Okay, we're at 2026 right now. They pushed that off until after the next presidential election. Again, I suspect recognizing that what they were doing was throwing a bone to evangelical voters who are like, this is great. The legislature is pushing religion, but also trying not to infuriate those people who don't want an established religion and who want to preserve the separation of church and state by saying, oh, it's not going to take place until after the next presidential election. And that's of real interest when you think about things like the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which the Republicans passed without a Democratic vote last July, which has already dramatically cut into supplemental nutrition assistance program benefits and Medicaid, which is one of the reasons that clinics are closing across the country and hospitals are hard pressed for money. They made most of those provisions, most of those cuts from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act take effect after the midterms. They don't want to get blamed for what's already in that bill. They want to pin it. They expected probably that the Democrats would pick up seats. That's normal for a midterm election after a presidential election. And they wanted to be sure to be able to blame it on the Democrats. I hate that crap. I really do. This is one of the reasons I teach as much as I do about the system, because people should know they're pulling this stuff. They really should. It just pisses me off. All right, I'll stop on that. One more quick thing. Somebody asked about having a constitutional convention. No, 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 because that is being pushed by the right wing. If you reopen the Constitution right now, they can write whatever they want. They can make an established religion. They can just declare we're a monarchy. They can do anything they want. What we need to do is enforce the Constitution we have right now and the laws under it. And I would argue amend the Constitution as well, which is part of its process and what the framers expected. And we have problems that we need to fix because we're a big country and so on. I'm not going to talk about that now, but you can tell exactly where I'm going today. And that's with a number of the Supreme Court decisions that the court handed down yesterday and today in its last 2 days of the session. And the Supreme Court tends to push the big things out till the very end. And that's what they've done here. And I think it's important to kind of step back mentally from the Supreme Court as it exists right now and recognize that they are the people on the Supreme Court, the 6 members of the right wing on the Supreme Court are no longer acting like a body of jurists, like a people who are really trying to figure out the law. And there's a wonderful, I got very into reading about different justices. And I believe it was Justice Stevens once, retired now, who said, if you're doing it right, the questions that come up before the Supreme Court are not easy. And that means that there are good arguments to be made on each side. So how do you decide which is the better one? And what he said was that you have to decide for whatever advances democracy. That's what the Supreme Court should do. And yet the radical right on the Supreme Court now is absolutely operating as a political body that does not want democracy, that does not trust democracy, and is working to destroy democracy. And that is, if we look forward into reforms that we have to make, there are many that we need in the Supreme Court. It's too small because the country has gotten so much bigger than it was in 1869 when we limited the number of judges to 9. And, we since people can now live these really, really, really long lives and can travel really easily. But remember, in the early days of the Supreme Court, you had to ride the circuit on a horse. So it was a young man's game. We also probably want to do something about term limits now for the Supreme Court. I'm not going to make that argument here. We will make it in the future, I'm sure. And people will disagree. And that's what we should be doing in a democracy, is saying how we think it should be structured. But what they did over the last 2 days has been really illuminating in terms of how 6 people are destroying democracy and shaping our country. And again, if you're doing it right, you shouldn't have somebody like me complaining that it's 6 people. You should have somebody like me saying, I get it. Don't like it, but I get it. It's a hard case, whatever. Instead, you just simply can't do that any longer. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. The first case that really jumps out in this in the last couple of days from the Supreme Court is Trump versus Slaughter. And Trump versus Slaughter is a huge step forward in taking the modern American state, which remember really develops after 1933, and turning it over to the president. It is out. This decision is simply outrageous. And what I mean by that is that since George Washington, the first president of the United States, Congress recognized that there were things that needed to be done, but that the people in Congress didn't have the time to do themselves. So they needed to have bodies of experts to do things for them. They needed to set those people up. They needed to make sure they were experts, but then they wanted to give them running room to make regulations are later, but to give them advice on certain things or to change the way we proceeded in certain ways. That that idea of creating these agencies really takes off in the modern era after Franklin Delano Roosevelt takes office in 1933. He's elected in a landslide in 32. He takes office in 33. And Congress begins to create all sorts of agencies to protect the American people. And the one that jumps out to me from this period is the Securities and Exchange Commission. And the Securities and Exchange Commission basically guarantees that people don't cheat on Wall Street. And by cheating, I mean they have to be honest about the disclosures they're making to people who are investing in their companies. And the SEC looks after that. And they can't give one price to one person and another price to somebody else. The SEC makes sure they don't do that. And since then, there have been a whole bunch of similar agencies designed to protect American individuals. And the other one that jumps out, although there are many of them, is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, I'm a huge fan of the Environmental Protection Agency because it decides how much of some chemical is safe to be in our drinking water or in our air. Now, if you asked me what those percentages are, I literally would be back there going, I didn't even know what these chemicals are. And I sure don't know which ones are dangerous. This is why we want to have experts there doing the work for us. And we don't want them to be responding to political imperatives. We don't want them to be saying, we probably shouldn't be drinking a lot of, I'm going to make this up, chlorine. But I'm, my president owns a lot of stock in whoever makes chlorine, so I'm not going to say that. You don't want there to be political pressure on those experts to change what they find. And one of the things that's happened recently is that the director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vogt, is trying to get rid of the expert advice for where to put federal grants in all federal grants, but really it shines in scientific research and medical research, where they simply want to get rid of the peer review of grant requests and instead put political appointees in charge of them, saying, well, we're not going to fund anything in climate change because that's a radical left thing. And we're not going to fund DEI because that's a radical left thing. What was the third thing that they were going after? I can't remember. There were three major categories, but basically they're saying we political appointees are going to get to decide where taxpayer money goes. Well, if you think about that idea and you take it to the government that is already in place, what the Supreme Court did in Trump versus Slaughter is they overturned the idea that the president cannot mess around in those agencies. So when a president takes office, there were about 4,000 political appointees, and those political appointees can be changed. And again, the really important ones have to be approved by the Senate. And this is how we got the cabinet we've got, and crucially, the Department of Justice, where the Republican senators, for the most part, said, yeah, if you want Pam Bondi, go for it. Or if you want Pete Hegseth at the Department of Defense, go for it. And the reason I mention that is because what Trump versus Slaughter does is it will permit Trump to do the same thing in those agencies. Previously, the heads of those agencies were protected by the Supreme Court. There was a case, I think it was 1935, called the case of Humphrey's Executor versus the U.S. And that's, I always feel like Humphrey's Executor sounds like an exotic bird from like the 1700s, but it is a case in which Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to fire a guy named William Humphrey. I think it's William Humphrey, because he wasn't on board with the New Deal. And the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. He's out of your reach as president. Well, John Roberts has wanted to get, who's the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, has been trying to get rid of Humphrey's executive since he was a young lawyer, and really trying to concentrate power in the president, because Roberts is among those who don't trust democracy, and they don't like the idea that Congress can set up something like the EPA, I'm going to pick on that again, and say to companies, you can't pollute, or you can't adulterate milk with formaldehyde, or any of the things that the agencies are supposed to do. So what they did yesterday is they overturned the case of Humphrey's Executor and said the president can, in fact, fire the heads of agencies and replace them with loyalists. So think about what that means for something like the Federal Trade Commission, where it used to hold the line on whether or not we had false advertising in the commercials that we see, or whether people were charging junk fees. They oversaw the relationship between companies and the American people in defense of the American people to make sure they weren't being ripped off. Now imagine Trump putting somebody in charge of that. And that's what we're looking at. We are looking at the takeover of the apparatus of the modern American state by this rabid pro-business presidency, that, there go our nonpartisan protections for the American people from big business, essentially. But that's not the only thing. And I just was looking at my notes. It's worth pointing out that those people would also be looking over Trump and MAGA Republicans. And just this evening, Reuters reported that Trump made $1.4 billion in crypto ventures last year. Now, do you think they're going to keep an eye on crypto ventures going forward? Guessing not, right? But that's not all they did. So they have basically turned the federal government agencies over to Trump and over to Trump cronies to do what they want with, which is just going to be ferociously pro-business and anti-American worker, anti-American farmer, anti-American consumer. And I would argue anti-American entrepreneur, because one of the things that the agencies are supposed to do is keep the playing field level for entrepreneurs to break into a market, right? And this is interesting, because you're seeing the Democrats increasingly focus on those groups and saying, we're just getting left out of the government here. Let's get back in the game. But that's not the only thing. So one of the other big decisions that came down today was the National Republican Senatorial Committee versus the Federal Election Commission, which I'm sure is going to end up being the NRSC VFEC, and nobody's going to know what it is, and it's going to show up on comprehensive exams for graduate students. But the reason it matters is it is yet another step toward putting more and more corporate money, wealthy money, into American elections. What the National Republican Senatorial Committee versus the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, says, and again, they divided it 6-3, was that any caps on what parties can spend in elections that they coordinate with candidates on is unconstitutional. It violates the First Amendment of those political parties. So, we're just shoveling money into our elections at this point. And it's very interesting that objections to that are not partisan. Republicans, independents, and Democrats all hate that. They hate it. Like 80% of Americans want to get rid of big money in elections. So the fact that the Supreme Court has just been gutting this since Citizens United in 2010, which came right after the American people elected Barack Obama, by the way, and was clearly an attempt. The Citizens United case was over a hit piece, a hit documentary on Hillary Clinton. You can see that there's this idea of pouring more and more and more and more and more money into, especially right-wing media. Because if you look at right-wing candidates that pay for media, if you look at the funding, you will see that the real big donors in America go to right-wing candidates. I think of the top 10 billionaires who donate to campaigns. 9 of them are Republicans, and 1 is a Democrat. I think that's right, and that is George Soros, which is why he's such a boogeyman for the far right. But they have the next 9, I believe. You'd have to check that, but I'm pretty sure I saw those numbers yesterday. But so what you've got then here is basically the big business and corporations now get control of our agencies. The party in power, the Republicans in power, if their rule goes through, and you can still contest that, by the way, will be able to decide where our tax dollars go for future investments. And that's one of the things that our scientific pipeline has always done, is it has really driven healthcare and innovation, and now that's going to be cut off in certain ways. But now you've also got more ability for the very wealthy to determine who gets elected. But I'm not done. There were 2 more pieces today. And one, they may not sound related, but they are. In another opinion, another vote of 6-3, the Supreme Court upheld the idea that states can prevent transgender girls from playing in girls' sports. And the whole idea of this crusade against transgender Americans has really taken over from the fight over abortion, because what the radical right did really since 1972, the anti-abortion movement begins in 72, the year before Roe versus Wade. It actually, someday I'll write about it. It actually begins in 1871, but I haven't had time to write that up yet. But in the modern era, it's 1972, not 1973. And they were able to continue to turn out radical right voters by promising they would do something about abortion. And then really the Trump's new appointees on the Supreme Court pulled the rug out from under that political argument by overturning Roe. So then all of a sudden they in the Jackson Women's Health decision. So they needed to find a new enemy to go after, and they picked the issue of transgender kids in sports, but not all kids. You're not seeing complaints about transgender boys playing in boys' sports. And this is a little bit of a rabbit hole, but that's really important, because what you're really seeing here is a gender-based argument against the idea of women acting as women. And that was the original idea behind the anti-abortion movement in 72. They weren't talking about fetuses. They were talking about women's lib and how women's libbers were dangerous for America. Anyway, why does this matter if you don't follow trans issues? Because this is a civil rights issue. This is, they're really deliberately using this issue to try and divide Americans. But at the end of the day, either you have rights in America or you don't. Either you have equal rights in America or you don't. And this idea of using trans people to become a wedge in our society opens the door. And this is one of the things Lincoln talked about all the time. Once you admit the principle that some people don't have the same rights as others, you've given up the whole game. Because then it's only a question of time till somebody says, well, what about you? And that's that, Lincoln talked about that again and again and again. And so having done this now again, 6-3, what this court is saying is that, yeah, some Americans have rights that other people don't. And that's like a huge red flag as well. What is it in George Orwell? Some pigs are more equal than others. All the pigs are equal, but some pigs are more equal than others. That I may be wrong about that. I haven't read that book in a long time. But anyway, I'm still not done because the other piece of this is that the decision of Trump versus Barbara, and that's the birthright citizenship case. And this birthright citizenship case, you may have read in some places it was decided 6-3 and others 5-4. And the difference between those two is that 6 of the members of the somebody's just said all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And that's exactly the quote I was looking for. In Trump v. Barbara, in this birthright citizenship case, 6 of the justices voted to uphold the Constitution. But one of those justices, Kavanaugh, did so not on constitutional grounds, but on statutory grounds. That is, he said, I don't think this violates the Constitution. It does violate a law. And if Congress changes that law, then I'm willing to let this go through. So some people are calling it a 5-4 decision, although it is technically a 6-3 decision. Why? Why is this not a great thing? I mean, they decided in favor of the Constitution. This is, yippee, right? And yes, I mean, they could have gone the other way, and then my hair would be on fire. But it should never have come before the court. It should never have come before the court. Literally, the 14th Amendment explains exactly what birthright citizenship is. And the debates in Congress over the Civil Rights Act of 1866, when they were hashing out what would become the 14th Amendment, first they write the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and then Andrew Johnson, the president, vetoes it, and they put the exact same language for birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment, saying that if you are born in the United States, you are a citizen, so long as you are subject to the jurisdiction of American laws. And that's the place where Kavanaugh's decision completely breaks down, is he says, well, there are 4 exceptions to this. Congress could just add another exception, but the 4 exceptions are all groups of people who are not subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. government, like foreign ministers. Like, you could be in the United States, but if you're just here quite literally as a representative of a foreign country, you are not under the jurisdiction of the United States. That's why you have diplomatic immunity, right? So this case, which was decided more than a century ago, and has never been questioned since, should never have come up at all. They shouldn't have taken it. And in fact, all the lower courts said this is the most blatantly unconstitutional thing we have ever seen, including people who were appointed by Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. So it should never have come up. And then 4 of the current Supreme Court justices were willing to overturn the clear language of the United States Constitution. Like, as far as I'm concerned, that's an impeachable offense. Like, if you don't believe in the freaking Constitution, what are you doing making decisions about what's constitutional, right? So although the vote was 6-3, as I say, one of the votes said this: if you change the laws, I'm willing to go along with this, if Congress changes the law. But it is simply appalling that we have 4 members of the Supreme Court who are willing to walk away from the very clear language of the Constitution and more than 100 years of jurisprudence, including from the Supreme Court. And similarly, who walked away from almost 100 years, 90 years of jurisprudence over Humphrey's Executor and over, the ability now that the Trump versus Slaughter case. So taken as a whole, and not thinking about these as individual cases, but rather as bigger cases, what you can see, I think, is the Supreme Court that has been absolutely stacked with right-wing operatives. And if I hear one more time somebody saying, well, the left, which I've described before, is not really part of our political discussions right now. We are the vast majority of Americans who would like to restore liberal democracy, and whose Supreme Court seats have been stolen by the radical right. If I hear one more time somebody saying, well, the left will pack the courts, the answer to that is we need to unpack the court, because the court has been packed with radical extremists who quite literally have demonstrated that they have no respect either for precedent, like Humphrey's Executor, or even for the Constitution, as they showed today with Trump versus Barbara in the birthright citizenship case. So Houston, we have a really big problem here. But before you sort of throw up your hands and say, we're done, think about where I started here with the SAVE Act. People keep saying, what can we do? Can we impeach a Supreme Court justice? Yes, they can be impeached the same way a president can be impeached, or a vice president, or whatever. And by the way, when you impeach the president, you don't lose the entire administration. That circulates periodically on social media. It's just wrong. I mean, read the article, the Constitution yourself. That's just not the way it works. One person, you can't. You're not. If your president is guilty, that doesn't mean the attorney general is guilty. So it's, you go after people one person at a time. In fact, we have never convicted a Supreme Court justice. We have impeached one before in 1804, Samuel Chase. But that was probably, or pretty obviously, an attempt to silence him politically, and so it didn't go through. It came shortly after the impeachment and conviction of a federal judge, but he was openly an alcoholic and exhibited real mental health issues on the bench. So there were a lot of people who thought he wasn't the only one who should go for similar reasons. But we have never impeached and convicted us, because remember, that's how it works. The House impeaches, the Senate convicts a Supreme Court justice before. And people are like, can't we impeach these guys? Well, before you even get to impeachment, Justice Thomas has openly taken extraordinary amounts of favors and gifts from Harlan Crow, a right-wing billionaire, that should force him to resign. There are, and he didn't disclose those. Samuel Alito has his own corruption issues there. There are plenty of ways before you get to impeachment to unstack this court. And what I would say about people saying we got to get rid of these guys soon, we got an election coming up. And if Trump had faith that he was going to win this election, he would not be moving heaven and earth to get that SAVE Act passed. And if you're looking to fight back against these Supreme Court cases, and for my part, I'm going all the way back to 2024, the fact that the Supreme Court put the president, made the president immune from prosecution for committing crimes in office, to me was a complete destruction of everything this country was based on. I mean, read my writings from that night. My hair was absolutely on fire. I think I went live that day. And I don't usually do that unless it's really a big emergency. But the thing to do is to focus on this election. I mean, if you have anything you can do to put skin in the game, to convince people that we are looking at the overturning of our political system and getting people to show up, especially in those swing states. The numbers came out today. Tallarico in Texas is running in neck and neck with Ken Paxton. Ken Paxton was just recorded with a girlfriend in Finland, I think it was. Get that material out there so that people really see what's happening. Because we're not in a good place. But again, people always ask me, how do you know? How do you know if you're in trouble? Are they going to win? What I would always say to you is play the other side of the chessboard. Are they acting like they're going to win? I mean, Trump is still obsessing over the reflecting pool and trying to insist that it was sabotaged, which is ridiculous. We are increasingly finding out that he is spending our tax dollars like water. While he is making billions in office with corrupt deals and not just this cryptocurrency stuff that I was talking about a minute ago. But, the New York Times on Sunday, I think it was, had a big expose of the fact he's done a more than $1 billion deal over mineral rights that are going to enrich his children going forward. The more we are seeing of all of these, all of this corruption, the more people know about that. And that's going to involve talking to your neighbors, talking to your friends, making sure people hear about it. The more people know about that, the more likely they are to repudiate this extraordinary corrupt presidency. If they do that and give the Democrats and their allies the tools to investigate, the more likely we are to create a new stable system that does hold people to account. And that's absolutely what Trump and his henchmen are worried about. Michael Johnson, the Speaker of the House, a Republican of Louisiana, actually said last week to a group of to a right-wing audience, he warned, they're going to come after us. They're going to investigate us. And he said, I am your protection. I will make sure that they don't do that. But we need to win the midterm elections. And similarly, J.D. Vance was recently recorded saying that Watergate wasn't such a big deal. And it was pretty clear he was trying to downplay the extraordinary corruption and dirty tricks of this administration. They're worried. And as I say, play the other side of the table. If they weren't worried, I'd be more worried. And one of the things that you can see coming out of places like Hungary, for example, is the more pressure electeds feel, the ones who are not implicated in wrongdoing are more likely to vote against those people who are implicated. Doesn't mean they're suddenly going to become Democrats. It doesn't mean they're suddenly going to change their worldview. But it does mean you start to find breaks like the one you saw in the House today, where enough Republicans refused to vote for the SAVE Act, that they refused to pass the National Defense Authorization Act, or they refused to attach those two things. That wouldn't have happened 2 years ago when the Republicans were riding high and passed that One Big Beautiful Bill Act, when, they said to the Democrats, we're just going to do it. We don't need your votes. We're going to go ahead and do it. And now they're having to live with the consequences, and they don't want to do that again. So keeping an eye on that, on the fact that the more pressure that people can bring to bear on the corruption, on the these decisions that are so detrimental, and making sure people understand that if Trump does to the EPA what he's done to the Department of Justice, where there goes our EPA, and if he does to the Federal Trade Commission what he has done to the Department of Justice, good luck with the advertising and with what companies can do to consumers, and good luck breaking into those new markets, because who's going to stop the SEC? So who's going to make the SEC oversee those things? So before you worry too much about we got to deal with the Supreme Court justices now, what we really need to do is get these people out of office and do a real house cleaning. And when we do that house cleaning, we are increasingly coalescing around policies that are popular. Like this housing bill was popular with Republicans as well as with Democrats. And, you think about healthcare. Who's really getting hosed on healthcare are rural Republican areas. They are open now to different ideas about that. And similarly, if you think about the consolidation that you're seeing, not only in urban areas, but also in rural farm areas, those are all areas where we could build a lasting coalition to push back against these people who are just taking us for all we've got. If you'd like to tune in live, I record these chats on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Maine time on both my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. If you want to hear more from me, I write Letters from an American every night. It's available on Substack and on Facebook, and the audio version of the nightly letter is available the following day wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, on Saturday mornings, I talk with Dr. Joanne Freeman, the historian of the early republic, professor, and dear friend about history and politics. We call our talks What the Heck Just Happened, and you can find them on YouTube. Politics Chat is produced by Lauren Westfall, music by Andrea Von Kampen.